Nope. Hi, everybody. I am Ron Brownstein, political director for Atlantic Media, one of the co-sponsors of the festival, and we are here to talk about the state of the American political system and its ability to produce solutions. First, I should say, and I think I can speak on behalf of all of my fellow panelists here, that we wish to thank the Aspen Institute for recognizing that in this age of 24-hour cable and the internet and talk radio, that one of our great national challenges is a shortage of opportunities for political pundits to have their views heard. So I do want to thank you for taking just a small step to rectify that. But what we are here to talk about is actually a serious issue, and that is wherever you sit on the ideological spectrum, I think virtually all Americans would agree that as a nation we are facing a complex of serious challenges, economic and social both. And yet we have a political system that is having enormous trouble generating solutions to these challenges. In fact, at a panel we were at this morning, one of our panelists I'll be introducing in a moment, Tom Wilson of Allstate, put up a slide that kind of summarized, I think, very well the output that we are seeing from our political system in the last few years. And the four kind of key components of it were volatile change elections, in which the country kind of veers back and forth between the parties, as we saw in 2006 and 2008 toward the Democrats. In 2010, Republicans with the biggest midterm victory for either party since 1938. Polarization of party caucuses in Congress. In fact, the long-term studies of this by political scientists tell us that we are witnessing the highest level of party line voting in Congress, Republicans voting with Republicans, Democrats with Democrats, usually against the other side, since Reconstruction, which was a while ago. A sour and distrustful public that is down on institutions of all sorts. You know how they used to say in Alabama, thank God for Mississippi, so we wouldn't be last and everything? We in the news media now feel that way about Congress, I want you to know, because at least there is one institution below us on the trust list. And finally, a lack of progress on major issues. So in that sense, it is a pretty daunting picture of where we are at this point, especially when overlaid against the backdrop of 9% unemployment and striking degrees of pessimism in public polling about the opportunities for the next generation. Is there a way out of this morass? Can we find a way to build working coalitions for change? That's what we're going to kick around here for the next hour. And to do so, we have a panel that brings a really good diversity of viewpoint to this. To my immediate right, Jane Harman is the president, CEO, and director of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and formerly a Democratic member of Congress from the great state of Southern California. Vin Weber is the managing partner of Clark and Weinstock in Washington and a former Republican member from the great state of Minnesota. Tom Wilson is the chairman, president, CEO of Allstate Corporation, and they have been our partners at National Journal in a very exhaustive research over the last 2.5 years of how average Americans are experiencing the changing economy. And lately they have done some new work on kind of the real fault lines and areas of agreement in American public opinion that he'll talk about. To his right is David Axelrod, who is was the senior advisor in the White House to President Obama, will be a senior advisor in the re-election campaign, longtime media consultant, but most honorably of all, before that, was an ink-stained wretch at the Chicago Tribune. And finally, to his right, Mark McKinnon is vice chair of public strategies, the co-founder of No Labels, which is an organization that works to encourage cooperation across party lines, and was a senior media advisor for President Bush in the 2004 and 2000 campaigns. And before that, was a senior media advisor for many Texas Democrats. So can talk about this from many different angles. I want to start with a broad question that to some extent builds on what we were discussing at another session this morning. There's no question, as I said, that we are seeing enormous division in the political system in Washington. In fact, as we said, the highest level of party line voting that we have seen, certainly in the 20th century, really since the 19th century. Is this fundamentally driven by the political system itself or by divisions in the country? Or put another way, is the political system today more divided than the country is, or are the divisions we are seeing in Washington a reflection of genuine fissures within the country itself? Mark, do you want to kick us off?
It's absolutely Washington. It doesn't reflect what's happening in the rest of the country. It's so distorted that it's remarkable. We have for a lot of reasons that we could spend a whole hour talking about, created a system unlike it's ever been before, and the Congress folks can talk about that. I mean, some people say it's always been like this. It hasn't always been like this, and I'd love to hear their views on that. But the fact is, for a lot of different reasons, a very fringe minority have a very dominant voice. They've got big microphones, and so at a time when we have arguably some of the greatest challenges in our history, we have a system that is more paralyzed than ever and rewards paralysis. In other words, we have a system set up that rewards bad behavior. And just as a quick example, talking to a senator the other day, a Southern Republican senator, and talked about trying to establish some bipartisan activity, and he was at a town hall, and he talked about reaching his arm across the aisle in a bipartisan effort, and somebody stood up and said, if you put your arm across the aisle, we're going to cut it off. So those are the kind of things that the system are dealing with, and that's why we created no labels to try and give voice to what is really the majority of the country who feel much differently than that and really want us to work together.
I thought that was a clothing line.
Yeah. Tom, talk about, you have sponsored some research recently trying to look at the question of what the real fault lines are in the public. Is the political system more divided than the public, or is the political system reflecting the divisions that actually exist in the country at large?
I would agree with Mark, and it's the former. We went out to the market and we used traditional consumer segmentation work to look at the market and said, if you were a competitor and you had this whole market and you had red and blue and you wanted to be a new competitor there, how would you go about looking at the market? And so we segmented the market. We came up with 6 segments of the market, not 2. What we found is that the Dems and the Republicans combined have a third of the market, not 2/3, which is what a lot of people think. And so there's 60% plus in the middle, and they want compromise, they want action. And what's very interesting is when you segment them, part of the segmentation is based on whether you believe in government or believe in private enterprise. The other is on trust, which I think is a really weak point of where we are, and you brought up earlier. The level of trust in institutions that is an all-time low, and that's also segmenting voters.
David, from where you sat, and you certainly were in some of the most heated legislative battles of the past several decades, does it feel to you that there is that much of the public that in fact is open to compromise, or is the public also a force of division as we kind of look at these issues?
Well, I think the public is, I agree with these guys. I think most Americans are not terribly ideological, and I think they're pretty pragmatic. There is a sense of frustration among those voters and those Americans about the level of polarization there is in Washington. And the one thing I would say, Ron, is that there are a lot of factors that are influencing this. One is the way Congress is chosen, and you have redistricting schemes that basically create polarities, and so that's a piece of it. You don't have a whole lot of genuinely competitive congressional districts. The news media itself, since we're all under the microscope here, has some responsibility for this. The advent of cable television and the sort of round-the-clock news cycle, obviously the impact of the internet, is that every day is election day in Washington. And the ability to take the long view and deal with problems in a responsible way is often thwarted by this feeding of the beast. And so there are a lot of factors working against what I think is the desire of the American people for pragmatic problem solving at a time when they feel a desperate need for it.
Well, when you were in Congress, you certainly took your share of heat at times from Democrats for seeming to be too open to kind of reaching out and compromising with Republicans. I'm interested, and maybe both of you could kind of address this, what level of pressure do elected members, both in the House and the Senate, but of course the House is your experience, now face to stand with their side on every issue? I mean, is compromise now defined as capitulation within the caucus?
Well, let me make a couple points. First, Ron, I was remembering that you and I and Arnold Schwarzenegger received the Leon Panetta Institute Award for bipartisanship.
Yeah. Really big bowl.
It's gigantic. It
Schwarzenegger
fills
was the only
up
one who could lift it,
half of the
actually.
Woodrow Wilson Center. It's so big. In 2008, and we were probably on a list of 10 people who might have qualified for that. Vin would have been on that list too. But there is no political value attached to being bipartisan, which I was during all my 17 years in Congress, which is 119 dog years. It was a long time, and it had some painful chapters. And you're right, I paid a quite high price in one case for that. But are we coerced into voting the party line? The hard part now is that almost all the votes are, and the content of the votes is determined by a small group of leadership on both sides. The work that members of Congress, most of whom are pretty smart and capable, would like to do and might do in committees gets changed. And what comes up on the floor is the most strident version of let's blame them for not solving the problem, or let's blame us for not solving the problem. There is no reward for working with them to solve the problem, because that would give them some credit. And if you give them credit, then, oh my God, they might actually continue in power. And the goal is to wipe them out. And I think that paradigm is totally, tragically broken. And it was interesting when I left Congress in March to assume a bipartisan job. I have to pinch myself every morning to think there is bipartisanship left in a kind of major part of Washington. A number of people in both parties said, "We're so jealous you managed to escape." That was the operative verb. Really, really sad.
Is that the paradigm now, then?
Well, first of all, excuse my Aspen throat, which I have because I was smarter than the hotel and turned off the humidifier. But I think that...
There's a problem with Republicans.
Okay. All right. I'll try to digest that. But okay. First of all, these guys have the data, and I'm not going to argue with their data. I think that it doesn't take into account one thing, though, which is that the general public may be ready to compromise. The activist base of each political party is different than it was when I was growing up. And they are both they are less willing to compromise and much more polarized. One of the things I say to try to get people's attention on this is I said, one of the reasons we have an increased phenomenon which people call partisanship, paradoxically, is because of the weakening of the political parties. When we had strong political parties that needed to put together broad coalitions, they filtered to an extent special interest demands on the political process. But over the course of the last 20, 30 years, for a whole bunch of reasons related to campaign finance and media and everything else we've been talking about, interest groups in both parties have replaced the party structure itself in many ways as the primary force driving the two parties. They're less flexible, and the nature of an interest group is precisely the opposite. Parties aren't beloved, but parties do have an interest in putting together a majority. An interest group does not. It has an interest in catering to its members who care maybe about one thing or one small subset of things. And I think that is a huge change in our political process that's contributed to this problem.
David and Mark, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just want to add one other thing. We talked about a couple of reasons for the polarization, but just to your point about the breakdown of the parties and the emergence of special interests and the power that they have, that's all been exacerbated almost exponentially by the recent Supreme Court decision, which basically said that corporations and unions don't have enough money or don't have enough influence on the process and need more. And so a typical important Senate race in this country, let's say Colorado, for example, I forget what the exact numbers were here last time in the last race, but the special interest money spent in that race was by a factor of like 5 to 1 or even more than that. They outspent the actual candidates in the race. So it was really a battle between the Chamber of Commerce and the unions rather than a race between the candidates.
David, is it tougher, and Mark too, compared to when you first started doing campaigns, is it tougher for an elected official, is it riskier for an elected official now to take a position that clearly is antagonistic to a big part of their base? In the age of the internet and more primary challenges, is it easier for the base to basically say, no, you can't, you have to stay in line on this than it was 25 years ago?
I think the answer to that is yes. But I want to go back to a point that Jane was raising and that you were raising. You know, it is an ideology that is driving a lot of the dynamic in Washington. It is a very, very strong desire to stay in power. And so it is the manipulation of partisanship for political goals. I just wanted to read this one thing relative to the question you asked. This was an interview that Mitch McConnell did with the New York Times in January of 2010. and it's before the health care fight, before the economic stimulus package, before President Obama even took office, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader, had a strategy for his party, used his extensive knowledge of Senate procedure to slow things down, take advantage of difficulties Democrats would have in governing, and deny Democrats any Republican support on big legislation. And then there was a quote from him in here on health care saying, it was absolutely critical that everybody be together because if the proponents of the bill were able to say it was bipartisan, it tended to convey to the public that this is okay. They must have figured it out, Mr. McConnell said. About the health care legislation. And he said that even minimal Republican support could sway the public. It isn't, it's either bipartisan or it isn't. And of course, one of the things we ran into on health care was that every time we thought we had reached some sort of agreement with Republicans, and we had spent months on this, and in fact, and we talked about this earlier, that the bill itself contained what were thought to be some fairly significant Republican principles, they got pulled back by the leadership. So I think that answers your question in part.
Go ahead, Vin, and then Mark.
One of the things that's contributed to this attitude is a phenomenon that at one time we would have all thought was a very good thing. The Republicans took control of the Congress for the first time in 40 years in 1994. The important thing is, prior to that, there was really no election in that 40-year period of time when they had any hope of taking control of the Congress. Mm-hmm. Almost every election since then has been competitive at every level. Both parties figured they could win. Maybe they weren't right, and we're going into another election with exactly the same thing. The competitiveness of elections is something most of us from a civic standpoint would think is a good thing, but it has contributed to this attitude that every vote is crucial, and we can't give anything to the other side.
And then Mark, yeah.
But there are a couple of other things to factor in. One is that the seats that are competitive are the ones in the middle, and they go back and forth. The people in safe seats in either party have the seniority in Congress, and they're the ones who chair the committees and are the ranking members on committees, and they have a louder voice. Well, the Tea Party voice might be an exception in the House now, but in general, that's how it is, and they are the people who have to compromise the least because they automatically get reelected. And I just wanted to add two more things. One is gerrymandering of districts. It'll be interesting to see what happens in California this time, now that we have these citizen commissions drawing the lines. There are going to be a lot more competitive districts, and I frankly think that's very healthy, even though it's a lot of heartache for some of the folks who have to run against each other. I think it's healthy for our democracy and for bipartisanship. And the last thing is, Congress only meets 3 days a week. Most people live outside of Washington. They never meet anybody. They certainly never meet anybody in the other party unless they go on a congressional trip, which usually gets panned by the press as a boondoggle. Some of them are not boondoggles, but nonetheless, that's the only time they make bipartisan friendships. And it's easy to demonize the person you don't know.
Mark, and then Tom.
Well, and it's not even subtle anymore. It's overt where you have powers within the parties. For example, Senator Jim DeMint, who yesterday said, if any Republicans endorse a debt ceiling increase without the following caveats, which were very severe and strict, no tax increases, huge cuts, balanced budget amendment, we are coming after you. And so you're right, it's about power and retaining power, but now these guys have to look around and look at people like DeMint and other special interest organizations that have a lot of money and a lot of power, and they're going to come right after them. So it takes a lot of fortitude for anybody to stand up now and be bipartisan and work across the aisle. Very difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure all those things are reality, but if they were working in our company, I would just say they're excuses. I would say that leadership is about once you get the job, it's not about self-perpetuation. It's about doing what's right for the whole. And what the whole said is we want progress, we want jobs, we want education fixed. There's not a big disagreement on what the American population actually wants. They want their incomes to go up if they're middle-income people. I mean, this is America. Like, we know how it works. And so it's distressing to me to hear people say, well, but for this, I would do that. No, it's about standing up and standing tall and being a leader. The other part of leadership, though...
If I worked at your company, they'd only need one vote, and that's yours.
Yeah, that's true. But the other thing, that's true. But we also like to have this view of leadership. I think one of the things about leadership is being able to mobilize others. And that means getting others to do willingly what they would not do by themselves. So even if you're elected in this primary, heavily partisan district, as a leader, your job then is to convince them they need to compromise their views and accept compromise and not cut your arm off because, so that's what, and I think it's lack of leadership. And I think that's why trust is so low in Congress.
Well, Vin, let me ask you from the other side about whether there are value or benefits out of the way politics now works. I mean, you were very involved. You came to Congress in the late 70s, and you were part of the Conservative Opportunity Society, which ultimately, with Newt Gingrich, led to a fundamental change in the way the minority party viewed it. When you got there, Bob Michael, I think historically Republicans had viewed themselves as kind of a junior partner to the Republican majority. And the argument of Gingrich et al. Was no, I'm sorry, the Democratic majority. The argument was no, we should not be the junior partner trying to put our thumbprint on their bills. We should be an opposition party, trying to clarify the choice and stop them and replace them.
Well, what we actually said was we should be a majority party.
Right, right. But by being an opposition party.
And the notion that junior party status was going to be, partner status was going to be good enough forever was not good enough for us. I mean, it was a very simple political calculation. You know, we'd been in the minority all that time. We thought that the majority of our own party was quite comfortable being in that junior partner position. And at the same time, we saw Ronald Reagan getting elected and then reelected, carrying 49 states. We thought something's out of kilter here, that we cannot take control of the United States House of Representatives, the body closest to the people at the federal level, while at the presidential level, we're carrying 49 states. And we attributed it to the fact that our party was not challenging the majority on issues that mattered. So it contributed to polarization.
Over those 35 years, roughly, or 30 years, we've moved into a world where the McConnell quote really is true for both sides now. When the Democrats are out of power, they don't view themselves primarily there as to influence the majority legislation. They view themselves almost as a parliamentary opposition party to vote against it and to clarify the difference. That does give the public a clearer choice, the same way Republicans did in the first 2 years under Obama. Are there any advantages to that system for the country in which we have one party basically governing at a time and the other one opposing, as opposed to working across party lines? Is there any advantage to that? Let me ask Vin and then others can
Well,
come in.
I mean, you have to, there are probably some advantages to it, but more disadvantages when you face great big problems. The advantage is, I mean, at various times in our history, you found the opposite problem, which is that people lack confidence in the political process because, as George Wallace famously said, there isn't a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. That's not necessarily a good thing either and doesn't lead to good outcomes. It didn't lead to a good outcome in terms of the whole Wallace movement. But when you have big problems that you need to solve, history tells us you've got to have some degree of bipartisan cooperation to solve them, and the polarization you're talking about is not contributing to that.
Are there any advantages to this system or mostly disadvantages?
I think almost all disadvantages. The big loser is good public policy. I don't think you make good public policy on a partisan basis, and I think we've proved that. Even signature bills that I was enthusiastically for, like health care, I think was compromised in ways that were not good in order to get Democratic votes to pass it with no Republican votes. And as David said, there were Republican principles in the bill, and I was an active member of the Health Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the bill we crafted with some bipartisan support was a heck of a lot better than the thing, in my view, that became law. And again, that was because the paradigm had to be adjusted to meet the way we do business now, which is slam the other guy in the face.
David, the flip side of more uniform Republican opposition in your first 2 years was unusually unified support among Democrats. Democrats behaved in a more parliamentary manner than they did under Bill Clinton. Every Senate Democrat voted, relatively speaking, but every Senate Democrat.
To the extent that Democrats do.
Yeah, right. Every Senate Democrat voted for health care. Are there advantages to this world, or is it mostly a negative?
Well, here's the problem. What McConnell was outlining there was essentially a strategy of obstruction to stop anything from happening to assure failure. And our notion, maybe naively coming in, was we were facing the greatest economic challenge since the Great Depression. It was clearly a national emergency, and that we could find bipartisan support to get some things done. The President was on his way up to the House Republican caucus to talk to them about the Recovery Act, and they issued a press release before he arrived saying that they had taken a vote and they were going to vote unanimously against it. So it's hard to operate in an environment like that. I don't think there are advantages to a system in which obstruction is the objective. The objective should be solving problems. And I think if people have a fundamental critique of the political system right now, it's that so much energy is spent on scoring political points and trying to enhance the political advantage of one party or the other, and not nearly enough time is spent earnestly trying to solve problems.
Mark, you could say that we have a quasi-parliamentary system now with one twist, is that we don't have it's a quasi-parliamentary system without majority rule because of the filibuster, which is a combination that really isn't present anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, you asked raised an interesting point earlier about if we eliminated the filibuster, how many things of these big issues would have passed and we would have dealt with them. I wanted to just poll the audience really quickly on a quick question. But I want to preface it by saying to your last point, you know, it was tragic, I thought, during the days of the early fiscal crisis when some people in my party were actually saying that they hoped that the president would fail. I mean, that is a purely partisan, I mean, people are more...
They said they hoped he'd fail in pursuing policy objectives that they thought were destructive. And it was interpreted as meaning they hoped that he would fail the country. I wouldn't have voted for the stimulus.
All right.
I would not have voted for either the stimulus or the health care bill, and I don't want the president to fail.
Fair enough.
It's really bipartisan discussion.
So here's my question. I realize that this is not a standard demographic right here. But let me just poll the audience. How many of you think that there should be, a show of hands for everybody, how many believe there should be no changes whatsoever to Medicare and absolutely no increase in revenues to address the budget crisis? Okay.
Well, give them a chance to answer.
Okay.
And Tom, in their research today,
Our poll showed, when we segmented, we asked, how should you reduce the deficit? Which I think is the popular thing. I'm still trying to figure out. We must have solved the jobs thing already because we're on to the deficit. I'm still trying to sort that one out. But we asked people, what would you do to reduce the deficit? Social Security, almost anything you do with Social Security was a third rail for all those 6 segments. If you asked, how about raising taxes? Would you be open to raising taxes on people over $250,000? 5 of the 6 segments were over in the 70 to 80% support range. One was at 30. That was the pro-business conservatives. So they were sort of toxic. And they're also what we would define in that poll as the hard Republican core. If you asked about income adjusting Medicare, it was pretty uniform. Almost everybody thought it was a good idea. So I think it would mirror this group here. But yet we don't seem, I mean, you all know better than I, we don't seem to be having this conversation about, why, clearly if you don't have enough money, you got to spend less and you got to get a little more. It's really not that complicated.
I actually think we're having that discussion.
Yeah.
We may not be getting as far as we'd like right now, but we're...
I hope we have that discussion because I don't think there's a solution unless entitlements, the tax issues, both closing loopholes and enhancing revenue, and cutting spending, including defense spending, are all on the table, and some balanced decisions are made. And if we don't have both sides playing, we're not.
Further from that.
I mean, reading the comments out of yesterday's White House meetings, we're not getting anywhere. We're sort of in a.
Jane, you used the appropriate word, which is balance. And I think what Mark said is absolutely right. I think there are long-term challenges to Medicare that are undeniable. And it is absolutely ridiculous to suggest that everyone in the country should sacrifice to deal with this problem, except for the very wealthy.
well, let me ask you, I want to bring in, direct this personally both to David and Mark, because you've each had experience dealing very directly with this question, which is, can one party alone sell the country on big change at a moment of such widespread distrust of politicians? Mark, you were there painfully in 2005 when President Bush tried to overhaul Social Security, was unable to get a single Democratic co-sponsor, and faced enormous resistance in public opinion. David, you were there in 2009 with health care reform, which you did pass, but without any Republicans and with majority opposition, usually in polls, by the end of the process. Given where we are and the way people feel about Washington and politicians, can one party alone do really big things at this point? Mark, maybe you start.
Well, it's a real frustration for those of us who work in politics and public policy, and no matter what, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, Social Security is a good example of something that President Bush, from the very beginning, early on in the campaign, said he wanted to reform in a way to make the system sustainable over time. And as I can tell you that there were a bunch of consultants in the room that said, don't you dare, don't you open your mouth about this thing, both during the campaign and then during the administration, said it's political death. And And unfortunately, that's exactly what it ended up being. I don't want to get into the merits of the proposal, but it was quickly demonized by Democrats and demagogued in a way that killed it in the crib.
If you had had Democratic support, do you think it would have been different in selling it to the country, or would it have been almost just as difficult?
No, I think we could have. I absolutely think we could have.
The thing you get from bipartisanship in the vote is not so much that the policy is easier to pass, maybe it is, but you get sustainability. The problem, I would say, from the standpoint of this administration is that the health care reform, because it was not bipartisan, lacked legitimacy with a percentage of the country, and it's under assault everywhere, in the courts and all over the place. That's true of other policies, too. If you have a bipartisan policy, you sort of insulate it from assault going forward and allow it to be implemented, people to see how it works.
David, was your view there was a public value in bipartisanship apart from the legislative?
Well, look, absolutely. I think the president absolutely believed that it would be most desirable to move together on this, and that's why, much to the chagrin of many of Jane's colleagues, we had lengthy discussions with the Republicans to try and forge that. And we had, there was one senior Republican who sat on the president's couch, talked for 2 hours with him about the health care plan. At the end of it, the president said, well, it seems like we agree on 99% of this bill. Can you give me your support? And he said, no, not unless I can find 10 other Republicans who will stand with me. Mm-hmm. And Senator McConnell, as he said, this isn't conjecture on my part, was hell-bent on anybody cooperating. So would it have been easier? Yes. Look, healthcare was a very difficult issue. The president knew going in, if you were going to choose an issue to work on, you wouldn't choose that one to create a political wind at your back. He worked on it because he still believes, that there are structural issues involved with our healthcare system that will implode over time if we don't confront it, and felt if we didn't confront it quickly, we probably wouldn't get to it, as we haven't for generations. And so he wanted to get to it, but it wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by a sense of urgency pushed by our budget director and others.
Rather than Tom, honest Tom question.
I agree with that, and I think it was an important thing to do, but it had a huge cost as it spun out. Because first of all, it was it sopped up all the brain cells for a year while other problems festered. And I think, I don't know that we would be farther along with the jobs problem, but it is the huge problem, and it's going to be the motivator for a lot of voters in 2012. That was one. And two, I think because the product was partisan, its acceptance, and Vin's right, it's being challenged everywhere, has been very tough. And so you can check the box, we got health care, but what didn't we get? I just want to make one other point, and it's positive about President Obama. I think it means a lot that he has a bipartisan cabinet. I really do think it means a lot, and not just the token Republican in some lesser important post, but Bob Gates at the Defense Department. And now Leon Panetta, who was a Republican and is a Democrat, in case anyone missed it, is now going to the Defense Department, and David Petraeus, a Republican, is coming in to take his job at the CIA, and there are other Republicans all over. It sends an important message, and they add value. And I also think that the Afghanistan policy that was announced a few days ago is a very good course correction. And it's interesting that Obama got slammed from the left and the right, which to me is a mark of courage, his.
Can I just respond to one thing that Jane said? And I appreciate the kind things you said about the president. I just wouldn't refer to the healthcare initiative as checking a box. It was dealing with a fundamental problem that really threatens
you are right.
It's the biggest single driver of our deficits.
Well, we want to have a partisan, no. You are right about that, and it does mean a lot. I'm just saying that I think the stubbornness in clinging to that only, and perhaps not trying to do
but Jane, you
less
know what, that
on
is
a
precisely
bipartisan
why
basis.
that's precisely why it hasn't gotten fixed in generations. And he had the opportunity to fix it, and he took it understanding that there was cost to it. And I think in the future, people will look back and say, it was maybe even Vin will look back and say it was a good thing that he did it. I'm not asking you to do that today.
I voted for it.
We'll put that response off till later.
Tom, let me ask you, going back to the broader question I asked them, because that was the research this morning touched on this as well. How do you build trust in the public for solutions that are produced by the political community and establishment at a time when there is so much distrust of Washington. What are the elements you think, for example, if either now or in 2012 or in 2013, there is a big agreement to try to reduce the debt, what would it take for the country to accept that as something good for me and my family?
Well, I think, it's like all things. First, trust is earned, not given. And the reason trust is low is because it hasn't been earned, because people want to see something done. And so I think this quest for the big idea, the big issue, and the single point solution is not what Americans really want from our research. They're making compromises every day in their life, and so to get to where they want to go, and they think politicians should as well. So I think first would be just do something, even if it's little and it's not the biggest thing. So we're not going to solve the deficit in one piece of legislation. It didn't get here through one piece of legislation. So I would just start to work. I would try to bundle some things together, because I think what happens is they get stuck on these one issues, like whether it's a deficit or it's unemployment. But if you look at what happened in the lame duck session we were talking about, there was a great piece of legislation. There were some tax cuts in there for business, so they liked it. The people, unemployment, and it went well. But then what happened, as soon as it got done, we got done with the holiday season. The marketing message then went back from "we can work together" to "let's fight over issues." And so I would also change the marketing message. So, it's like business. Jane, you said, that's great that there's bipartisan people in the administration. Business has not felt well represented by the administration. It's our fault, their fault. We don't have a great reputation either, so I'm not standing up here saying we've done everything right. Financial services in particular are still digging themselves out. And the way we're trying to dig our way out is just do things every day that people say, yes, I'm going to believe you eventually. And I think that's what politicians need to do, is just start doing stuff instead of getting on the news and saying, like Mitch McConnell, we should all stand up and do nothing. People don't want to hear that. They hired these people to do a job.
Let me ask one more question, then I'll bring in the audience, then I'll have a final question for the panel. As we mentioned at the very beginning, after a pretty stable period from the mid-'90s to the middle part of this decade, we are in a very volatile period in our politics. We had a wave toward the Democrats in 2006, another wave toward the Democrats in 2008, and then the biggest midterm victory for either party toward the Republicans in 2010. Why do you think American politics is growing more volatile in this way? And what are the implications of that volatility for our ability to build coalitions to tackle some of these problems? I'm looking at you, David, to start.
Well, look, politics doesn't live in a vacuum. Politics lives alongside the experience that people have every day. And this has been a period of enormous and not altogether positive change in our economy, insofar as the middle-income person in our country experiences it. People have seen wages flat over a long period of time. We saw mean wages actually decline in the last decade. Prices for everything go up at the same time. People dealt with it. Single earner families became double earner families. People maxed out their credit cards, borrowed against their home, and the whole house of cards collapsed in 2008. There's plenty of reason for people to be disquieted about where we are, and they want, they would like a focus on those problems. And to the degree that those problems aren't solved, that they don't feel better about it, there's volatility in our politics. That added to that, all the other sort of structural things that we talked about. And I just don't want to leave without amplifying on Mark's point. The amount of money that's in our political process now is absolutely unbelievable. And so, if you accept the notion that for many, not all members of Congress, but many members of Congress, perpetuation of themselves in office is the principal, then money becomes very, very important. And so these interest groups that Vin talks about become exponentially more powerful in the process.
Is more volatility an inducement or an impediment to more compromise?
Well, it's more volatile because, for a lot of reasons. We are sort of an instant gratification society, but I think that, and increasingly so, and we want change, we want it more quickly. But that's exacerbated when people are feeling pain, and so they raise their hopes, and then things don't change as quick as they want to, and so these cycles swing dramatically back and forth, particularly during times of economic stress. But looking at the political environment right now, I feel I feel some of David's pain and looking at the reelection ahead, because I remember in 2003, as we were looking ahead to our reelection at a time when it was a difficult economy and a conflict in Iraq, and less than 50% of the people supported the president or his policies, and you're trying to figure out, well, how do we do this? And just I was on with your friend Bill Burton on television the other night, and I heard him say exactly what we were saying 4 years ago, which is it's a choice and not a referendum. So here's the playbook, David. For
Yeah, there you go. Jane?
I think more volatility makes members of Congress risk averse.
Risk averse.
Risk averse. And they sort of hide out and don't stick their heads up because with 24/7 media, and especially the rise of tweeting and email, the reaction can be severe if they wander off the path. And MoveOn.org on the Democratic side, and there are a lot of other equivalents on the Republican side, really punish you if you do something different, and it hurts, and it motivates voters. I just want to make one point about voters. We keep talking about the American public. It's the voters who are polarized. I think a lot of the public is bipartisan, and I think we have low turnouts in elections because a lot of the public, the non-polarized folks, or partisan folks, are turned off by what they see.
Does the structure of our election, should it encourage more compromise, or does it make them risk averse when it's turning over so fast?
When you're risk averse, whether it's in nature or humankind, you tend to band together with your own, and that's the partisanship that you're talking about. That's what's going on. But it's also a case of the two parties having very different interpretations of the political environment right now. And as you pointed out, we've had two monumental elections in a row. A huge win for the Democrats in 2008, big win for the Republicans in 2010. Both of them interpreted anyway as being quite ideological. And both parties agree that one of those elections was an aberration. They just don't agree which one.
Yeah, there you go. Tom, Jane made the point that right now, if you are seen as someone who compromises, there can be a lot of pain. We had 3 successful sitting senators defeated, 3 successful challenges, primary challenges to sitting senators in 2010, almost as many as in the previous 28 years combined. There is clearly kind of an organized way to deliver pain from the base of each party on members who are seen as kind of collaborating with the other side. Is there, I mean, you talk about in the research there being kind of a general desire for compromise, but is there any mechanism for that to be expressed in the political system where people who compromise are rewarded and those who are intransigent are punished?
I hope so. I guess I would say it this way. The loud voices are 1/3 of the market. They're loud now. They're driving a lot of action and behavior. The 2/3, many are voting, but not as many as the 1/3, and certainly not as many throwing their money as the 1/3. But eventually they're going to get mad. And they're going to do something about it, and you're going to see people getting thrown out of office, not by the far left or the far right, but people getting thrown out of office because they're not in the middle. And because that is where people are. You hope they'll exercise their votes. You see it, I was walking with Walter Isaacson earlier, and he made an interesting point, which was, if you look at the last election, both parties put up somebody who was viewed as more bipartisan than anybody else from their party, which says that when you're thinking about the broad population, people get it. So I think hopefully we will get the vote because we need it. I think what a lot of times Washington doesn't understand is all this discord and partisanship. Yes, it stops legislation, stops us from fixing Medicare, but it also inhibits us economically. And so the increased uncertainty has business leaders that I know not investing or not investing in America. It has consumers, even though I agree we've got to find a way to get them more income and get them out of debt.
Well, demand has something to do with it.
Yeah, but right now, you ask them what they're worried about, they're all worried about their jobs. You've talked about the nuclear blast of the recession on people's, 2/3 of America knows people who are close family members lost a job. So, unless we get this done, we'll never get the economy going.
One thing on this issue, Jane says the voters are polarized. The truth is that in primaries, that's certainly true. The swing vote, though, is not, and one of the ironies of the last election is that 18% of independents voted, it was plus 18 of independents voting Republican. It was plus 8 for Democrats in 2000. and 8. Those independent voters were the margin of difference for Republicans in taking over Congress. They were not voting for more partisanship. They were not voting for more ideology. And, you know, I think that the Republican Party misread that message. And you see the result in states like Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida, where there's a real backlash to the governors there for overstepping what they thought was an ideological mandate.
Interestingly, we'll go to questions. Tom Davis, the former Republican congressman from Northern Virginia and the chair of the NRCC, has argued that the way each party, that the volatility is rooted in the inability of each party to stay close to independence because of the centrifugal pressure that each of them face, that as soon as they win, the agenda, the pent-up agenda is such that it makes it very hard to hold the allegiance of independence for very long, whether it was Terry Schiavo and Social Security in 2004 or health care and some other things in 2009, 2005. Let's go to some questions, and we got one in the back.
Thank you. John Dibbs from Palo Alto. David Axelrod, I was in Washington, had a conversation with one of the cabinet members, and I said to him, when is Barack going to tell the American people that the era of cheap gasoline is over? And he smiled. He said, I don't think his political advisors are telling him to do that. And I looked at him and said, I voted for change. So why aren't the political advisors telling him to tell the truth?
Well, first of all, I think people have gotten the message that the era of cheap gasoline is over. I filled up my tank the other day. People seem to get it. But, you know, you're asking a larger question about energy policy, environmental policy. You know, the President's done a series of things on that to try and push us in the direction of alternative energy, to try and push us in the direction of conservation. He raised fuel efficiency standards for the first time in 30 years, and we're continuing to do that. He did that on an administrative basis. So we're working to do those things. And you know, the President also said in 2008 that change was not easy, that change does not come quickly, that you have to stick with it, that you have to keep pushing. And particularly given the circumstances that we face coming into office, that's particularly true. But we have to keep moving in the right direction.
Mark, you want to add something?
Well, just an interesting sidelight on that. The issue of gas prices is always a very sensitive issue in campaigns, and I remember in the 2000 campaign when it was. But Americans are also pretty realistic and pragmatic, and they want real solutions, and they want to be told the truth. And an interesting part of that election was that everybody thought we were down about 3 points in September, early October, or sometime in September. And because Gore had had a good run up in the convention and a good convention and was doing well. And everybody thinks that it was the debates that flipped that around. When we went back and looked at the data, it was not actually the debates, but about a week before that when gas prices were a big issue, and Al Gore went out and said that he was going to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to bring down gas prices. And the problem that created for Gore was that it sort of pierced that little run-up of authenticity they had, and everybody said, oh, God, here he goes again. This is just a completely overtly political move to try and make us believe that, you know, he's addressing the gas price issue. So
we had a similar situation in 2008 when the rage in Washington became doing away with the gas tax on a temporary basis. And most of the other candidates embraced that. Obama did not, and said that he thought that it was not going to be effective, and he thought it was a gimmick. And a lot of folks in Washington thought, I had very smart people say, gee, you guys are cutting your throats here. That was pretty bold. It wound up being a certification of who he is.
We got another question in the back?
Strong leadership.
Yeah, hi, I'm Steve Adler. I'm editor-in-chief of Reuters. What would have to happen politically and structurally for there to be a viable third party that could capture this consensus in the middle that some of you seem to think exists?
Mark, yeah?
Well, I'd say one thing. First of all, I think that there's a great appetite for alternatives, but the system is rigged against those alternatives. And the way the system's rigged is ballot access and money. It's incredibly prohibitive to try and get on ballots in all the 50 states, and there's laws in all the 50 states that the parties have worked very hard to make it difficult for people to get, and that's why you only see a Ross Perot or people talking about Bloomberg. So it's all about ballot access. But I would just say to you that The appetite's as strong as it's been. It's like '92 and a lot of other times when there's been a huge rise in independence. The party affiliation is lower than it's ever been historically, I believe. So people are really hungry for an alternative, more voice and more choice. And I would just suggest to you that that the time is ripe and some things may be happening out there.
And is this, I mean, you do, as we've had more ideologically homogenous parties, especially in Congress, does it create an opening, or is it just too many structural barriers?
I'm an outlier on this issue. I don't believe in a third party. I believe in the two-party system. We have probably some of the most generous laws in the country in Minnesota for third parties. And the one time they produced a victory, the third party gave us Jesse Ventura as governor.
Floyd Olson?
Well,
Gave you Floyd Olson?
under a different set of laws 80 years
Okay,
ago.
I'm saying,
But you're making my point. We have a very strong three-party tradition in Minnesota. It hasn't exactly worked out the way people want in modern times. And I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, I think we've got problems with our parties. I agree with most of the problems people have described here. I look around the world, Jane knows this issue better than I do, but multi-party democracies have some inherent instabilities to them, and I wouldn't want to trade away the advantages of our system for the disadvantages of those systems.
I think, Ron, you or I don't know who asked that question, but what are the chances of moderate voices in each party trying to change that party? That would be nice. Alexander Bickel years ago, I think it was James McGregor Burns wrote about how we have four-party politics. We have two parties in each party. And I guess I would like both parties to value compromise and solving problems in a way that they don't.
The great lament in that era that the parties were too differentiated internally and didn't offer people a clear choice. We kind of solved that problem. Over here.
Yeah. Well, I just thought I'd mention an observation that I don't think it's really a crisis to blame either the Democrats or the Republicans. We have two great examples in the last week. Governor Christie, a Republican, just passed an incredible budget with pension and entitlement reform. And in New York, Governor Cuomo was able to get bipartisan support with the Republican state Senate for gay marriage, among other important issues that were passed. I think the real problem here is leadership. And Mr. Wilson made a comment which made me a little bit sad to hear the CEO of a major company kind of sheepishly apologizing for business. But business is the great engine of growth in this country, and I don't think we have anything to apologize for. I think there are a lot of mistakes made, things that need to be improved, but the problem has been, and the reason I think that the Republicans have dug in, is this president has consistently attacked entrepreneurs, business people, and industry, and instead of seeking to partner with business, has vilified them. And I think that's why we have this divisiveness now. And I think if we could get the president to come around in some way and see this as a partnership with business, that America is a great country. It's been advanced by capitalism and by free enterprise. Instead of trying to attack it, I think you'd see a lot less of this bipartisanship and bickering and less defensiveness by the Republicans.
All I can remember is sitting in a room in December of 2008 and being told where our economy was and that we were facing potentially a second Great Depression. The president took a number of steps, including cutting taxes, including 17 different tax cuts eventually for small business, and a series of other things. And I remember the stock market, and Tom probably remembers this, being at 6,500 or so at the beginning when we got there. And I remember, as you mentioned last fall, and Jane was part of this, I remember a bipartisan move for 100% expensing, for a payroll tax cut, for extended other tax credits for business. So I understand the talking points and I hear them loud and clear, but the reality belies the talking points. The reality is that the president took some very strong steps when he came to office to save the country from a larger disaster, and part of it was providing more incentives for business.
But David, if I understand the question is not entirely about policies. It's about the rhetoric of the president, and I would say more broadly about the Democratic Party in bashing business. And I would offer a suggestion to you. I would agree that Republicans discredit government by generically attacking government. But that's a mistake. They shouldn't be doing that. But I think you should also agree the Democrats ought to hold back on the rhetoric bashing the people that create wealth in the society.
Nobody is bashing business, but
Oh.
there is no. I mean, I'm not sitting here bashing business, but I think to say that there was some culpability for the financial disaster we had because some irresponsible decisions were made by people, and the United States government had to step in because of that, is a source of irritation to a lot of Americans. That's not to say we should exalt the job creators. We should support entrepreneurism, and in every possible way we can. But we shouldn't give sort of a blanket exemption to anyone because they're in business when they behave irresponsibly.
I'm right in the middle of this, in both sides. I would say there's truth on both sides of that. Some of it, businesses clearly don't feel loved in America today, and so that holds them back a little bit. Some of that is what's said. Some of it's what they hear what's said. So, you're always listening with your own ear on it, and so when you hear somebody say something a little negative, maybe you ignore the positive. So there's been as many positive statements as negative statements, but you don't hear the positive ones as much. So I think the idea, though, that the public sector and the private sector need to work together to fix this, because this is the worst economic situation we've ever been in. And not only is it the worst economic situation, we're also out of money. And so we don't even have any money in the bank, so we have to figure it out. And if the public and private sector don't come together, lots of different ways to do it. I think people have tried, but when you look at, it's very interesting when you look at the segmentation we did and you look at the two extremes, the pro-regulation liberals and the pro-business conservatives, the thing that they are the most different on, and it's by a factor of like 10 to 1, is belief that the government is terrible or belief that business is terrible. And I think leadership needs to stand up and say, it's not right. The reason we're in this thing, yes, businesses made some mistakes. I'll tell you, the government made a whole bunch of mistakes too, called Fannie and Freddie Mac, who put all kinds of debt out there, let all these people buy these houses. People made mistakes. They know they made mistakes. They're paying for it. We're paying for it. But when we start to pointing fingers, that's not a way to get an answer.
Let's squeeze in two more questions. Go ahead.
I'd like to take up on the previous questioner's theme of leadership and Mr. Wilson's, I think, very insightful comment about leadership. And my question goes to both when the Democrats controlled both houses, no budget was offered or passed. And in the budget that the president recently offered, it was voted down 97-0 and treated as almost a Jon Stewart moment. So my question is, could you explain to us how the president's response to our budget crisis with the budget that he proposed that was voted down 97-0 is a manifestation of the kind of leadership that Mr. Wilson has been talking about?
Explain it with one word, and that's politics. It wasn't offered to be passed. It was offered to be defeated so that people could make the talking point. The fact is the president proposed a budget that included the more significant fiscal cutbacks than anyone has in many, many years, and offered it as the beginning of a process that we're now going through to make some bigger inroads on the debt. I do want to return to this other question, though, and to your point, Tom. We're on the verge of passing a reform of the antiquated patent system, which is important. You talk about helping entrepreneurs. That will help entrepreneurs. The president has been working, and he's been around the country trying to form compacts between businesses and community colleges so that workers can get trained in skills that are relevant to the jobs that are emerging. That is cooperation. That is important. So, I think that there is a high level of engagement on these issues, and you're quite right. If we're going to solve these problems, we have to work together. We want to find a way. There's $2 trillion on the books of American corporations right now. We want to see them in the game. We want to see them investing. We want them to see them creating jobs. But it isn't a minor point that the demand is affected by what's going on with consumers. And so, you know, I think as most of these people would, most of your colleagues would tell you, demand is a major element of this. And we've got to get our middle class going again and
Jane,
spending.
you wanted to add?
Yeah, on the, I think we all agree with that. On the budget issue, 2 points. First of all, the president appointed a budget commission, which in December made some pretty interesting recommendations. This was Alan Simpson, the former senator, Republican from Wyoming, and Erskine Bowles, former chief of staff to President Clinton. And you don't have to like all of them, but I like a lot of them. And sadly, that thing has languished. It would be nice to revive it. Of the, I think, 20 or so members, not the 2/3 required, but more than half of them endorsed this as a starting point. So I'd love to bring that back. I'd also like to remind everyone about some fairly recent history in the 90s when Bill Clinton offered a budget in 1993 which only Democrats voted for. I voted for it. It was a career-risking vote for me and for many others who lost. I won by a rousing majority of 811 votes after a recount and a challenge. Yay me. But 4 years later, in 1997, an overwhelmingly bipartisan majority of Congress, including me, voted for a balanced budget, and 5 years of growth ensued. I don't think we can get there again, but we surely can get closer to that if we, for example, revive Bowles-Simpson and using the bully pulpit of the president, perhaps, and the bully pulpit of leaders of Congress in both parties, takes some courage, put some of these bipartisan ideas back on the table.
Majorities of both parties in both chambers voted for the 97 budget. It seems like a very distant world today. You got a question here?
Knowing that the American public is dramatically losing their patience, what about term limits? More severe, that's for term limits. And let's talk about campaign contributions. The last thing that was passed is with people could only give $2,000, but then they had some other application where you could give $25,000 to the party. I mean, that was a joke. How are we ever going to come together? Well, let's put term limits on. Let's get political contribution caps.
I wonder if anybody here from California was applauding for term limits. Anybody thoughts on term limits?
Well, real quickly, let me address the second half of that, which is campaign finance reform, which I've worked on for a long time and feel very strongly about. Congress is never going to reform itself on this issue, and so the only way to do it, and it's a long shot, but it's been done before, is to invoke Article 5 of the Constitution and go to state constitutional conventions. And the interesting angle on that is that you could, if you open this up, by definition, when you open up the state constitutional convention, these other issues, term limits and others, so you could bring together some interesting divergent forces, those that support term limits and maybe line item veto, and people maybe more conservative ranks for those who support campaign finance reform could pull it together, and that's the route to go. It's a long, tough shot, but that's how it could happen.
Sure, the Bill of Rights will survive that process.
Jane, California's had some experience.
Elections are term limits. Let's understand that. And some very senior members in both parties, all of them moderates, lost in the last election, as we know. But in California, term limits were imposed about 15 years ago or so. And if you're paying attention to that state, the legislature in California is more polarized than ever in history. Governor Brown, who was elected on this theory that he was going to be somehow in the center and deal with the budget problems, has basically thrown up his hands in the sense that he cannot get any Republicans to support putting on the ballot the issue of continuing some of the tax programs in the state, not raising taxes. And now he's going to go to an initiative measure and have the public vote on it next year. But term limits in California, I would say, in state term limits have failed.
It's hard to legislate these things. I mean, what happened with term limits there is that politicians didn't go do their duty and go home to their businesses and families. They ran for another office. And so they were just as concerned about playing the game as they were there not term limits. And on the issue of campaign finance reform, as I said, I think money in politics is a huge problem. But we always try and attack it from the supply side, but the demand keeps growing for it. The cost of communicating becomes more expensive and so on. And so we create a cottage industry of lawyers who find ways to circumvent whatever laws we pass. Somehow, I mean, the essence of politics is communication. If we could find a way to make it possible for candidates to communicate without spending millions and millions of dollars, we might have a better chance of controlling this.
Let's work on that.
Vivian, I'll ask you a question, then I'll ask a final question. Term limits were in the original contract with America, but not the sequel. No. Has it lost favor in Republican circles?
Yep. They couldn't pass term limits back in 1995. What they did was the one thing they could do was term limit committee chairman, and that is still in place for Republicans. You can only be a committee chairman for, I think, 3 terms in a row. Yeah. But they couldn't. There was no chance that they would pass out a term limits constitutional limit. Kind of make one additional point, because we've been talking about special interests, and I participated in that discussion a little bit. It's important to understand there's 2 parts, at least, to the special interest equation. Yes, big money, corporations, unions, blah, blah, blah. Ideological interest groups are arguably at least as powerful and maybe contribute more to the paralysis and polarization that we're talking about, because they command constituencies out there, whether it's right to lifers or right to choicers or gay rights advocates or anti-gay marriage people, taxpayer limitation, gun right. Those are they're a little different in their impact than simply the institutions that have big money, but they have a huge impact on the process.
I want to ask a final question before we let you guys go out to the beautiful afternoon. And Tom, you're exempted from the first half of the question if you want to be. But I'm wondering, starting with Mark and then working down this way, do you believe the 2012 election in its outcome will be closer in the popular vote in the Electoral College than 2008 was? And will 2012 leave us positioned to improve in 2013, building broad coalitions to get things done, or will it leave the system more polarized than it is today?
I'm an eternal optimist, and I think it is going to be closer. I think it's going to be a very, very close election. I'm encouraged, though, by signs that I see, and maybe it's my confirmation bias where I pick out information that I want to see. But I was really interested to see Mitt Romney just yesterday talk about the importance of bipartisan cooperation and working across the aisle. That was a pretty remarkable thing in the middle of a Republican primary. That gives me a little bit of hope. On the other hand, on my darkest days, we had a no-labels meeting in Washington last week, and 10 senators came to see us, which was really encouraging to me that we could get 10 senators to come see us, period. But the reason that they came was because they're so desperate for help from the broad middle of America and for people to encourage the sort of message that we're trying to send. At the same time, they were very dispirited and very discouraging. It just tells us again how messy democracy can be. So I'm starting to think that maybe we should just go to an accountable authoritarian regime.
Did they come in unmarked cars with sunglasses? David, will 2012 be closer than 2008, and will it leave us more or less positioned to achieve bipartisan change in 2013?
In the interest of business and commerce, I've bought Tom's exemption from him.
Okay.
No. I'll answer the question. Look, we won a substantial victory in 2008. By modern standards, it was almost a landslide. By definition, this has to be a closer race. I expect a closer race. I think what Burton said is not just glib. I think it is the reality, and you know this from your own experience. For 3.5 years when you're President of the United States, every day is a referendum on you. For the last 4 months of a campaign, it's a choice. And we'll have a big, vigorous debate on this. In terms of what the future holds, I think part of it has to do with the outcome of the election. In 1984, Ronald Reagan won a huge victory, and the Democratic Party reconstituted itself after that and ultimately led to the Clinton election and so on. I believe we're going to win this election. I think sensible people on the other side are going to take a look at it and say, this didn't work, and what do we have to do to make ourselves more saleable? At least that's my hope. The optimism is contagious when you sit.
So what you're saying is basically, if you beat kind of the intense small government Tea Party argument in 2012, Republicans will be more willing to compromise in 2013.
Look, we haven't mentioned the fundamental thing that disturbs me, which is that we have an environment in which you can't disagree without discrediting your opponent in the most fundamental ways. That I disagree with Vin Weber, therefore he is not a good American. That is a very, very
that was a hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that hopefully some of the steam will come out of this after this election, and people step back and say, this is not this is not a profitable path.
Tom, will 2012 leave us better or more in a better or weaker position to achieve compromise and consensus?
Thank you for exempting me from having to do a political projection. Although I'm never really sure how good they are anyway.
Yeah.
So,
they're worth what you pay for them.
But I believe in the power of the people and the consumers, and we will come back to the middle. This is a great country. People believe in the country. Politicians will have to come back. It'll swing, and so I don't know whether it's 2012 or not. I guess I would say what I hope is that the 2012 election is based on what people do between now and 2012, not all the positioning they do between now and 2012, because the country still needs to get moving, the economy needs to get moving, and if we spend all of our time worrying about 2013, we'll have let another year and a half go by without really making progress. And so I'd like to see all of our people embrace bipartisanship and come to a common solution and roll the dice that as leaders, that's how they get reelected, not because they appeal to some extreme.
Ben?
I think it'll be a closer election and a closely divided government after the election, regardless of who wins. And I'd like to believe that that campaign will leave us in a better position to solve some problems, but I'm a skeptic about that. I very much strongly agree with Jane about the Bowles-Simpson Commission, and I'm disappointed it hasn't gotten more traction, but I wish I could see some reason why it would be better after 2013 to solve some of these problems. And I hope that it is, but I just don't see it. I think this is the time to try to accomplish it, and despite the difficulties, no matter how steep the hill is, we should keep trying.
Well, I think a week in politics is 100 years, so between now and 2012 is 10 million years. And it's hard to answer that question in the abstract. It matters who the Republican nominee is. There's a wide spectrum there, and some are, I'll leave that in my bipartisan manner. So it matters about that, and it matters about the economy. Jobs will be a motivator for voters. And finally, I just came from a panel where everyone's talking about moderate Muslims rising up and changing the tenor. Where are the moderate voters or non-voters? They need to rise. You need to rise up too and demand changes. And if you've got the same access that the extreme voters do, and if you are active in this campaign and demand that the candidates talk about solving problems, not just blasting the other guy, you can change the campaign and you can change the quality of leadership that comes out of whomever wins the election.
Well, among the many reasons you need to rise up is because our time in this hall is over and we have to vacate it for somebody else. But thank you for joining us. Would you join me in thanking this terrific panel?